Well, as some of you may have known, or now you do know, I've been out of the church circuit, if you like, for about a year or so. In that time, I discovered, perhaps not surprisingly, that the biblical text is not heard much outside of a church context. It's not actually much referred to, much less sought out as a reference, a source for gaining knowledge, a resource for negotiating the tangles of life. It has nothing on Google. But as a person who has stood at the front like this and proclaimed from that text, proposed that it does indeed contain wisdom, deep knowing, an overarching record through time of the journey and struggle of people. And it's one that we can identify with, find inspiration, hope that indeed it is good news that relates to real life. That the biblical text is largely absent from the life of the majority of the population gives me pause for thought. Not just about the Bible, but about the whole religious enterprise. Is it more substantial than the air that we blow into it? Is it more than just a human enterprise? When preaching into a Christian context, we begin with that biblical text more often than not. For one who aligns themselves with the Judeo-Christian lineage, we might understand Scripture as a narrative. It uses myth and metaphor, history, poetry, prose, letter and in law. A narrative of the experience of what it is to be human, the way humans have chosen in and through time to live, to orient themselves in relation to one another, to creation, and of course to God. For inherent to Scripture is that creation is indwelt by God, through whom all comes into being, without whom there is no life. Well, assuming we assent to Scripture as having unique influence, perhaps even authority for us, we might see that it traces or tells a sort of overarching story as we allow it to speak to us, perhaps to disturb or dismay us at times, or delight us. Perhaps we find it echoes our own experience of life, that we join ourselves to a story told through time of human life in the world, in all its wonder and woe. It's a curious narrative, though, because it's kind of out there, over there, isn't it? And yet sometimes when you read it, you find it's actually in here, close by. So as I return to a church context and encounter the biblical text from that outside place, it is a curious experience. It is easy enough to speak inside the doors of faith, of Bible, and of God. But if we say that this Scripture expresses more than religious themes, if we think it says something about human potentiality that precedes and eludes the bonds on the bounds of our Judeo-Christian communities, and we say that the divine threads through all of life, indwells and imbues creation, without whom the whole of creation doesn't come into being, then how is the knowing of that communicated? How is it heard? How does it sound in the world when that very text is not known? Do we need to know of God consciously? Do we need to know the story to be known by God? Does Scripture, this strange tale of human divine encounter, apply to those who are outside this insider community? Now, I know for some that's perhaps irrelevant, because after all, it's an insider text. It's only for those who are chosen, not accessible to anyone else. But you see, I have a problem with that, because I happen to believe in an inclusive God who desires relationship, who intended creation into being, who meant it, you and I, to happen. Scripture comes into being through the communities who inhabit it. For it to have integrity in meaning, requires understanding and, more than anything else, translation. Tempting as it may be to devolve such responsibility to academia, we are not so absolved. The prologue of John's Gospel that we heard beautifully in David's funeral this last week goes like this. In the beginning was the Word, and those of you that know it can say it. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of the world. As followers of this Word made flesh, we, albeit often stumblingly, follow in the steps of this Word. We in our time are the ones who are to make the Word flesh, to bring into being the light of divine life in the world. It is we who are to translate the story of divine presence in ways that people may comprehend. So as today we have heard that gospel, how do we apply this idea? How do we translate this into life, if you like? Today we might call this a gospel of foolishness and irresponsibility. It makes no reasonable sense. Putting the whole flock at risk for one recalcitrant beastie, turning the whole house upside down for one coin, and then likely spending more than you found on the party afterwards is utterly ridiculous. I have a very strong childhood memory. I don't know how many of you had that beautiful Jesus, very clean, very long hair, with a beautiful lamb who had no dirt on it at all, draped across his shoulders. I have a very strong memory of that from a Sunday school room. So when I hear this story, it directs me to think that the story is about Jesus finding and rescuing, about Jesus seeking and finding, about a woman searching and cleaning and finding, and then of celebration and joy. Now, I know the entire story has always been there, but for some reason this time I noticed more the cause for celebration. It was over one sinner who repents. So this story is not all about the shepherd or the housekeeper looking and finding. It is also about being willing to be found and being willing to participate in relationship. A few years ago, in fact probably last century if I'm honest, I happened to be at a mall. I think it was Lynn Mall, before it was big Lynn Mall like it is now, and my two daughters were with me. One was 3 and one was under a year old. Despite what I thought was my very close attention to them, in a flash my eldest daughter completely disappeared. I searched everywhere I had been. I went to every exit there was, and when you have a lost child, there are more exits than you want to know. Panic-stricken, heart in mouth, I eventually made my way to the management office to confess I was one of those terrible mothers who mislaid their children, and to ask for help. They were lovely. They made contact with the security people in the mall. After what seemed forever, a very tall and beautiful burly security man appeared, bearing my blonde-haired, blue-eyed, missing daughter. Looking somewhat puzzled, she declared, "Hi, Mummy. This man told me I was lost." She had no idea she was lost until she was found. She had been having a lovely time playing in the toy shop. So who decides what lost is? And if you don't know you are lost, what is it to be found? And there's the rub, the foolishness of faith. For it proposes that we are intrinsically connected with the source of our creation. It proposes that creation was intended that we were intended into being before we knew anything of it, and we can know the source of our creation. It's very hard to prove intellectually, and it's made no more credible when we further propose that creation is an expression of divine love, of a God who, as in today's gospel, seeks and searches and desires relationship with each of us and the whole of creation. Because each of us is already beloved, we are already whole in God. But it's not a relationship we're forced into. It is something always of our choosing. I'm not sure if any of you have read anything of Dr. Abraham Heschel, a Jewish academic theologian and author. I read a bit of his stuff. It's a little bit mind-banging. It puzzles me and unmasks me at times. But he writes this: "More grave than Adam's eating the forbidden fruit was his hiding from God after he had eaten it. Where art thou? Where is man?" That is the first question that occurs in the Bible. It is we who hide, he suggests, who flee, who have an alibi. God is less rare than we think. It is humans that were first to hide from God and continue to do so. It is God's will to be here. But when the doors of the world are slammed on God, God withdraws, leaving us to ourselves. God did not depart by God's own volition. God was expelled, is in exile. It is not God who's obscure, it is we who conceal God. Our task is to open our souls to God, to let God again enter our deeds. Life is a hiding place for God. We are never apart from God, who is in need of us. To align yourself with a religious lineage such as Christianity is a choice. The stories of the community of people gathered through time tell us of a divine encounter in life, in time, in this world, of a God who gives us life and freedom to use that gift, freedom even to exile God from our life. In and through this life, God seeks us, calls us, desires to meet and be met by us. That we are here in this place suggests that we, each in our own way, to greater or lesser degree, have chosen to open our ears and our eyes and our hearts to God, are willing for God to be alive in us. Let me ask you, how? How, other than through the lives of ordinary people like us, can the light of the life of the world be known? How, other than through willing and genuine encounter with each other, with the person we meet on the street, every encounter with another person, with each person we meet, can the word be made flesh and be translated into the world? It matters how we are and what we do. It is, of course, in us to conceal ourselves from God who sees us as we are, but today we choose not to. We cannot make those who have exiled God do otherwise. God grants them such freedom. Their doing so diminishes the richness of God expressed in the world. It is a loss for us. Even so, the boldness of faith would claim it cannot eliminate God, whose hiding place is indeed life.